Gregory Aller was 24 years old when space aliens first told him he would become president of the United States. His parents recognized he needed help and enrolled him in a study at their alma mater, UCLA. For more than a year on medication, Greg maintained a 3.8 college GPA. He was recovering, then the doctors running his study took him off his medication. In May 1990, he threatened his mother with a butcher knife, then hitchhiked toward Washington with $2 in his pocket to assassinate President Bush under orders from the aliens. The researchers had been watching his relapse develop for months. The study continued. This is the UCLA schizophrenia medication experiment. Keith Nuchterlein and Michael Gitlin were researchers at UCLA Medical Center who had spent years studying one specific problem. Schizophrenic patients on antipsychotic medication suffered serious long-term side effects, involuntary muscle movements, liver complications, physical deterioration, and many stopped taking their medication voluntarily as a result, which caused them to relapse anyway. Nuchterlein and Gitlin wanted to know whether certain patients could be safely weaned off medication entirely, and whether early warning signs of relapse could be identified before symptoms became severe. They believed they could identify who was ready. Other researchers across the country were asking the same question. The research was framed and largely accepted as being in patients' best interest. The protocol was straightforward on paper. Beginning in 1983, patients were enrolled, stabilized on antipsychotic medication until their symptoms were under control, and then their medication was withdrawn. The study would then observe what happened next. 50 patients entered that withdrawal phase. Each signed a consent form stating their condition might improve, worsen, or remain unchanged. Nobody told them the researchers had already written in their own published academic papers that the purpose of the withdrawal phase was to observe patients until their symptoms reached what the researchers called the severe or extremely severe level. That is what the study was designed to produce. It was not on the consent form. Greg Aller had been one of UCLA's success stories before the withdrawal phase began. His parents, alumni who trusted the institution, had watched a year of real progress. The grades, the stability, the person they recognized coming back. When the doctors said Greg would be moving into the next phase, they believed in the program. What nobody told the Aller family was that there was no defined point at which Greg would be put back on medication if things went wrong. In the months after his medication was removed, Greg's family began noticing things. He was sleeping more, his conversation was harder to follow, he stopped talking about school. Every time they raised concerns with the research team, they were told the situation was being monitored. What that looked like in practice was a family trying to decide whether what they were seeing was being taken seriously, while the research team documented the symptoms and continued the study. Greg went approximately 6 months relapsing before being returned to medication. By the time the intervention came, he had threatened his mother with a butcher knife in their kitchen, convinced she was an enemy. He had set out hitchhiking toward Washington, certain that aliens had ordered him to assassinate the president. He made it as far as East Los Angeles before something broke through long enough for him to find a payphone and call his father. He was never the same again. The capability he had shown during that year of stability, the grades, the plans, the person he had been, did not come back. His parents had enrolled their son in a study at the university they had attended. With doctors they had met in person, the institution they had handed his recovery to was the same institution they would eventually be forced to sue. 23 out of 50 patients in the withdrawal phase suffered severe relapses. Several experienced more than one. Some reported hallucinations and paranoia lasting months after finally being returned to medication. Every deterioration was documented in the study's clinical records. Tony Lamadrid had been a student at UCLA before his illness. He was 23 years old, bright enough to earn his place at one of the most competitive universities in the country. And his parents were dead. He had been raised largely by his aunt and his older brothers, including Enrique, a Spanish professor at the University of New Mexico, whose wife was a psychiatric social worker. The people who knew Tony best were scattered across the country, doing what they could from a distance. When Tony enrolled in the UCLA study, the researchers classified his aunt and brothers as not qualifying as immediate family under the study's definitions. Their requests for information about his condition were turned away. Tony began deteriorating after his medication was withdrawn. He started making statements about suicide. His brothers heard about it through channels that did not include the research team. Enrique and his wife began trying to reach him directly. They knew what suicide statements meant. The research team had been informed that Tony's condition was worsening. What action was taken, whether his medication was being reconsidered, whether anyone escalated the statements, was never clearly established in the public record. What is established is that Tony's family, 1,000 miles away, were making calls and getting limited answers. On the morning of March 28, 1991, Enrique reached his brother by phone. They spoke. After the call ended, Enrique tried to call back. He called the hospital. He called anyone who might know where Tony was. For 15 minutes, he was trying to reach into a situation he had no control over from 1,000 miles away. Tony Lamadrid walked to the roof of Bolter Hall, a 9-story classroom building on the UCLA campus, and jumped. Campus police found him at 8:43 in the morning. At 9:23, he was pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center, the same institution that had been running his study, the same building complex where his doctors had offices. He was 23 years old. The study did not stop. It ran for 3 more years. In the weeks after Tony's funeral, Enrique kept returning to one fact. His brother had been making suicide statements. The hospital had been told, and nobody from the study had contacted the family, the people who had been classified as not immediate, to tell them how serious things had become. Enrique's wife was a psychiatric social worker. Between them, they had exactly the professional knowledge needed to intervene. Nobody had given them the chance to use it. Enrique began pulling every published paper associated with the study. The Aller family did the same. What they found was simple and damning. The consent forms given to patients said their condition might improve, worsen, or remain unchanged. Meanwhile, in a paper published in an academic journal, written for colleagues, not patients, the researchers had described the withdrawal phase's actual goal in plain terms. Observe patients until their symptoms reached the severe or extremely severe level. That was what the study was designed to produce. The families found the paper in a university library. It had been published openly. It was not hard to locate. It had simply never been mentioned to anyone who signed a consent form. The gap between what the researchers had written for their colleagues and what they had put on the consent forms was not subtle. The families filed suit in 1992. Fraud, lack of informed consent, civil rights violations. In 1994, the federal investigation found that UCLA had violated informed consent rules. The consent documents were missing required elements. UCLA was ordered to revise its forms and submit to closer federal scrutiny. The judge dismissed both lawsuits, not because the claims were without merit, because the families had exceeded the 5-year statute of limitations. No jury heard the case, no damages were awarded, no criminal charges were filed. Keith Nuchterlein continued running schizophrenia research at UCLA. His name appears on federally funded studies there decades later. The specific consent form language identified as inadequate was changed after the investigation. The architecture that decides how much patients with serious mental illness need to understand about what is being done to them in research was not. The framework that allows researchers to describe a study's purpose, one way in academic journals and another way on patient consent forms, has never been formally prohibited. Psychiatric medication withdrawal studies on schizophrenic patients continued to be conducted at other institutions in the years following the UCLA investigation, some funded by the same federal agencies that had found UCLA's consent process inadequate. What changed after 1994 was the language on one institution's forms. The question the Lamadrid and Aller families had been asking, who decided the study's purpose was to let patients reach severe or extremely severe before intervening, and who decided patients did not need to know that, was never formally answered. Tony Lamadrid died in March 1991. The study ran until 1994. The lawsuit was dismissed in 1997. The lead researcher is still working. Nobody stopped anything.